Okay, we're live. Amazing. Okay, thank you. I think we can start now. Hi, Doug. Um, and hi everyone else. Hi Lola. Hi, Daniel. Hi everyone. Um, and everyone else like is kind of joining in us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's kind of early afternoon where I'm at, but I'm sure it's like evening in Lagos, and it's still kind of morning in Denver. So yeah, good morning. Yeah, we can start now.
And in case I
Yeah,
don't
so
see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, right?
yeah. Welcome everyone to the second edition of Talking Design. This time we're having this session with Doug Collins. My name is Dami Oludumila, and I am a user researcher at PagerDuty, and I'm your moderator. So I'm joined by my Daniel, who's a product designer at Wallets Africa, and I'm joined by Lola Saliu, who's a freelance product designer and strategist. So today we'll be talking about something that is very dear to my heart. I'm talking about inclusive design. Anyone that knows me knows that I've been like, I usually would yell about inclusive design and like I'd go crazy about how accessibility and inclusive design are not the same thing. So today we'll definitely be talking about that. And we'll be capitalizing on user experience research for inclusion, right? And how we can kind of adopt inclusive design practices into
Anyone that
our
knows me knows that I
day-to-day responsibilities as designers and researchers, right? So today we're joined by the amazing Doug Collins. Um,
Woo,
I kind of had a
woo.
chat with him earlier on. He's like super smart, super knowledgeable. He's giving me some tips on how
You're you're
to
you're very kind, but
do
you
with
are way
research in the B2B space.
you are way overrating my
No,
skills.
you're amazing, man. Because I'm just because you're tackling like an Italian. I'm complaining about something really small. You're like but I have this, and I'm like, whoa, that's like some bigger thing, man. Like so, it's like you're like up here, and I'm just kind of like
Well, I
but
think well, and that kind of leads to something we'll talk about today, but I'm sure, keeping in mind that just because your problems are different than somebody else's doesn't make them any bigger or smaller, right?
right, true. Um, so yeah, I would love to give a quick introduction to probably people that probably haven't met you or haven't heard of you. It's going to be really long, so like
Oh, okay.
stay with me. So Dog is a seasoned user researcher. He has over 18 years of experience designing and developing digital products. He specializes user experience research and design, accessibility, and ethical design principles. He uses his following in the industry to teach best practices to UX professionals around the world through conference talks and social media interaction. So I've definitely seen him on Twitter, kind of just answering questions, and he's just like super nice. Like if you just kind of tag him, he's gonna like go straight up and answer your question. And so he has worked in a couple of different companies. He's worked at E-Trade, the Denver Broncos Football Club, Marriott International, Nordstrom, and other companies. And he's the editor of UXNewsMag.com, and his writing has appeared in different publications from Adobe, UX Mastery, User Zoom, and UX Booth. And he currently lives in Denver, Colorado, where he's a senior user researcher at CACI. So he's built a reputation as an energetic, uplifting spirit mentor with the UX community, both locally in Denver. I know he runs like a UX Denver community, and also internationally. I know I've seen him interacting with people from like Nigeria, from India, and from different parts of the world. Right, he's the founder and leader of NUXers. So it's a Denver-based group aimed at giving new UX professionals the skills that they need to be successful in the world. And he also runs daily UX discussions on Twitter using the hashtag UXTalk to engage different UX designers and UX enthusiasts from around the world in conversations in every aspect of UX design. And he was recently named one of the top 50 e-commerce experts to watch in 2020 by the Ecom Manager. So that's like a mouthful. Like I'm like, yo, man, it's like I'm just like just going and going and going and going and going. Your bio is amazing, man. But yeah, like I
Well, thank you. It's nice to have it read to you sometimes. If I ever need a boost to my ego, I'm just gonna ask someone to read my bio to me. I don't feel that skilled, but I'm always happy to help out. So I really appreciate y'all having me here, and I'm glad I can share some ideas, share some thoughts with you, and hopefully learn a little bit too. Because one of the things that I always try to keep in mind is I certainly am far from knowing everything, and there's a lot that I can learn. I try and learn as much as I can, and I'm trying to do better and be a better person every day. So hopefully I will learn a lot along the way too today.
Hopefully, we're hoping to learn enough from you too today. We're just gonna have like a conversation. We have a couple of questions, and we just kind of want to ask, but everyone like here would be engaged in the conversation, going back and forth, just kind of like train ideas, because we this is like a topic that we feel like needs a dialogue opened about. Like there's a lot of things that like people aren't talking about. They began to talk about accessibility, but they kind of neglected it and neglected inclusion, because we think that accessibility and inclusion are the same thing, which they're related, but like they're not the same thing, right? So this is kind of us just opening up like a space for us to kind of have that conversation, right? But before we start, I have some quick housekeeping stuff. Um, so this event is actually hosted by Asha Kotera. And Asha Kotera is a Nigerian-based design community that is focused on growing designers who believe in good design, who believe good design can change the world. Asha means culture in Yoruba, which is one of the languages spoken in Nigeria. And Kotera means a circle of people with shared interests. And we kind of understand the cross-disciplinary nature of design, and we're big on collaboration. We have it like super passionate about growth and competence, and we're always looking for people to learn cool things from, people that are doing cool things in the industry. So if there's someone here that wants to, someone that's listening to this talk would love to time or share like what they've been up to, or would like to nominate someone for a talk, you can reach out to us on Twitter at Asha Kotere. And so that's spelled ASACOTERIE. Or you can shoot us an email at hello@ashadesign.com. So ASADSGN.com, right? So that's done. That's like housekeeping. I'm not going to say that again, hopefully. And so I guess we can start, right? As I earlier stated, we'll be talking about moving from few to many, right? And how conducting user experience research for inclusive system is instrumental in this, right? And I would personally love to reinstate that this is a conversation. It's not an interview. We're not grilling dog. Like we're just having a conversation. Because like I feel like when we were kind of trying to figure out how to kind of script this entire thing and how we kind of wanted the conversation to go, we were like, yo man, this is like some pretty intense questions that even we didn't really have answers to. So we don't want you, or we don't want people in the audience feeling like, oh he didn't answer that question correctly. Like there's no like one answer. We're just having a conversation. We just kind of want to like pick his brain, figure out like what he thinks about this, and kind of go back and forth and just have an open conversation, right? It's all fun and games. Like we're just here to have a nice time, right? So while my partners and I have a couple of questions to guide the conversation, we're not expecting a perfect answer. As I earlier stated, we just want an open dialogue. So I think that leads me to the first discussion for this session, right? So inclusive design is a fairly unpopular topic, right? So I think that a good place to start might be to go to the basics and kind of define it for those like maybe one or two people that are just hearing about the concept for the first time, right? Or like they kind of are a bit fuzzy on what it means, right? So Doug, I'm going to throw this to you. So what would you define inclusion as, and what relationship would you say that it has with accessibility? So the second question is very important to me, particularly because I'm in the accessibility and inclusive design community. And so I've experienced like the tug of war that goes like between people in the different individual communities. And so some people are of the belief that inclusive design should start with the solid understanding of accessibility fundamentals. Some people in the inclusive design community obviously strongly disagree, right? So as an accessibility enthusiast that you are, I would love to hear your take on this, right? So how would you define it? Yeah.
Answering this is a minefield for exactly the reasons that you just gave. So I'm going to try and give this my best answer and see what I can do with it. So I'm going to start off by relating how I approach the difference between accessibility and inclusion. And I apologize if I'm looking over here too. My mom is actually getting wheeled back into surgery right now, so I'm getting some text messages about that on my phone. So apologies if I'm if I'm looking over there every now and then. But difference between accessibility and inclusion. So accessibility design at its base is understanding the different potential disabilities that people might have and creating design solutions to address those disabilities. You have disabilities like cognitive disabilities. It can be things like learning disabilities. It can be things like anxiety. It can be depression. It can be things like that. You have physical disabilities, right? So you might have someone with limited motor skills who has a hard time maybe using a mouse, so they navigate a page with a keyboard. You could have somebody that's deaf who can't hear. You have somebody that's blind that can't see. And one of the things that people think about accessibility concerns is that they're kind of limited to people that were born with these issues, when that's not really true. Everybody suffers from some sort of accessibility concern throughout their day, right? So I've got a 3-year-old who you might hear upstairs because his playroom is literally at the ceiling right above us. So if you hear Henry, say hi. But when I'm holding my 3-year-old with one arm, I have as many functional arms to use for my cell phone, for typing, for whatever else, as somebody that was born with only one arm. If I'm, driving through, or if I'm, walking through a loud construction zone, my hearing is as functionally disabled as somebody who was born without hearing. Obviously, the length of that disability doesn't last nearly as long, but it's there. And so when we talk about designing for accessibility, you're designing around the different physical, cognitive, emotional pieces that people might be suffering from that limit their ability to interact with technology. Inclusive design, I think, goes a step further beyond that. It's not just creating these solutions and really bolting them onto things that already exist, but it's starting with those tenets in mind, but also expanding into other things like cultural needs, right? So different cultural practices are going to dictate your design practices. So you might look at things like, for instance, one of the things that's really interesting from a lot of the UX stuff that I read is that most everything that's done in terms of research for things like eye tracking, reading, that sort of thing, is done on pages that are written to read left. I'm sorry, I'm gonna do this left to right. Let's make sure, I think I got that right for the camera, right to left, left to right. Not sure if my camera's flipped or not right now. But obviously a lot of cultures read right to left. And that changes the way that your page is going to be designed. It changes a lot of things about the design. And there's not a lot of reading research done like that. It's also about not treating these folks who have different accessibility needs or different inclusion needs as being some sort of outcast, which they certainly shouldn't be. These people are your primary audience. It's very easy to see the center and get focused on sort of your average user, right? But when it comes down to it, nobody's average. Everybody's got some need for accessibility or inclusion at some level, whether that's a fleeting accessibility need or a fleeting inclusion need, is very, very different for different people. But it's bringing everybody into the design process, considering everybody from the beginning, and all of those needs, and understanding that what might seem like fringe cases to you are not actually fringe cases. And the research bears this out. When we talk about accessibility needs, I think it's 1.3 billion people worldwide have a permanent accessibility need, which means that they have some sort of permanent vision, hearing, cognitive impairment, whatever it might be. And they're the largest minority of internet users on the internet. And when you expand that to think about things like inclusion, different cultural needs, different personality needs and wants and goals, it quickly expands into becoming the majority and the vast majority of internet users needing some sort of inclusion, attention to design. That's why it needs to be one of those things that's being talked about more. It needs to be one of those things that has more focus on it. It needs to be one of those things that we all need to be learning about going forward. How'd I do? Does that feel like a good primer here?
No, it was really good. Like you went into like the roots and you were talking like numbers. People always like to hear numbers. So
Yeah.
so yeah.
I have I have a class on Skillshare that I do just about accessibility design that I actually did
Wow.
before I got into inclusion. So that was an interesting class to run through, and that's where I pulled those numbers from. So I hope they're still valid because that was a year or two ago.
I mean, it's still pretty recent.
Yeah, I think we'll call it good.
I'm out of curiosity. So you said like you usually would run like so you said that you usually would run like an accessibility class. I'm really curious to hear before moving to inclusion. So what like did you know is there anything different between like accessible design and inclusive design? Or are they technically the same thing, but it's just like different words? People just like define it in different ways.
No, it's different because accessible design in particular is really focused on taking things that are already created or maybe already somewhere in the development process and making those existing designs, those existing pieces that we already think about, usable for people with some sort of disability.
Right.
Inclusive design is not bolting on solutions to things. It's not changing things that already exist, already in development. It's saying from step one, we are going to make this design to include as many people as we possibly can,
Yeah.
to address all those wants and needs and to have that as a mindset. So I tend to think of accessibility more of as a problem solving approach and
It's really
inclusion.
interesting you brought that up because yeah, yeah. Well, sorry for cutting you off there. But I find it very interesting that you brought that up because something that we kind of were thinking about um while we kind of were structuring things was the fact that people would usually um think about inclusion or talk about inclusion after the product has been shipped and how after the product has been delivered, right? So I have personally had conversations with people and seen people that advocate for inclusive design like after the product has been built, right? So maybe we can take the example of the Twitter voice note feature, right?
Mhm.
The entire Twitter team shipped that functionality, right?
Right.
Without considering like people that are hard of hearing or people that um can't that people that are deaf, right?
Mhm. Right.
And so it wasn't until they were called that they realized that they had made a mistake. And of course, like mistakes like do happen, but some mistakes are just more costlier than others, right? So I would really love to hear how you think that we can have these conversations earlier in the process. So maybe when we're while we're brainstorming and while we're doing user research or while like we're before things actually are created, like how can we start to factor even both accessibility and inclusion, right? Because they're I mean, I feel like okay, I'll give you an example, right? So we have like these doors that like you would like some doors that are not automatic. Like there's a button you can push to kind of enter like the doors, right? And some people did a study, and what they noticed was that even able-bodied, and it was like an accessibility button, right? But what they did notice was that like able-bodied and able-bodied quote people would still use those buttons to kind of access the doors, right? So that was kind of able to that changed the behavior of people. So people first, before, instead of like opening the door first, like just like using the handle to open the door, people would first see if the button works before they attempt to actually use the door handles, right? So, I mean, that's kind of an example. And I feel like I'm kind of asking two questions in one here, but that's kind of how an example of how factoring people after like factoring like accessibility after kind of switch things and then kind of influence people's behavior. So I guess my first question would be how can we um have these conversations earlier? How do you think we can have these conversations earlier? And how can we I don't honestly I kind of don't know why I brought up that door but an example, but I think I was trying to buttress a point. But my major question though is like how can we go about factoring inclusion or while it's being built and not after, right?
Right. Um, I think the first thing is just to be talking about it, right? We can't help people get into an aspect of design that they don't know about. And if
Right.
people aren't talking about inclusion as something that needs more attention, then that'll never change. So having these conversations just as a design community is really the best first step that we can have. I think from there, the biggest thing is to educate yourself as much as you can, and to learn the basic tenets of inclusion and accessibility design. And then from a hiring manager's perspective, make sure that those are questions that we're asking about, particularly for UX research professionals. Research comes at the beginning of the UX design process. It should always be step one, right? If you're going in and you're creating a visual design without any research behind it, you're not doing UX design. You're just being a UI designer, which, that's fine. That's okay if that's what your company has a budget for and that's what you're forced to do, but don't call it UX, right? That's something that's different, right? User experience is based upon understanding the needs and wants and goals of our users. That includes everyone. That doesn't include just what you see as your average user. So hiring managers need to be asking these questions about what UX researchers' experience with inclusion and accessibility are, so that they're hiring people that have that mindset. Or at the very least, if they can't hire someone with that mindset, that it's something that they're bringing in training for, that it's something that they're looking out to go get more information for, to try and figure out, how can we bring this in and be a part of our team? This all goes back to, there's kind of a dearth of senior and management level UX talent in the world right now, because UX world tends to hire not a lot of junior UX professionals and bring them along. They tend to hire mid and senior level folks, and all the juniors that are trying to get into the world are having a really hard time of it, despite being very talented, smart people. They just don't have the experience behind it. So the companies are kind of hedging their bets, moving away from things. We need to bring in more junior UX pros and teach them and train them on these things. So as us, as who are kind of in the mid senior levels of their careers, it's incumbent on us to be working with those who are already on our team, and talking with them about inclusion, and talking with them about accessibility, and bringing those up as pieces, and trying to do what we can to bring along our junior team members, and advocate for hiring junior team members so that we can bring them up to speed on these sort of things and make them understand how big of a topic they need to be, in terms not only of an ethical standpoint, but from the success of our company, right? We talked about how big of a need this is, not just on, for everyone, not just for one person all the time, excuse me, but for people that face some of these needs on a fleeting basis. And when you look at that, it's the vast majority of internet users that are going to experience some sort of accessibility or inclusive design issue throughout their day. It is imperative to include that to be successful as a company. It's only going to help you to be successful. So those are, I think, all the things we can do to kind of get that ball rolling. But we need to keep it rolling. It's incumbent on us to design with integrity, to design ethically, and to stand up for those things that are right in the world, because we are, in a lot of ways, the moral voice of a product design team. There's not really anybody else that has the needs and wants, the goals of the users on their mind at all times, besides the UX team, particularly the UX research team. So we need to make sure that we are comfortable with standing up for that and being the voice of our users as well.
Does anyone have any follow-up questions? I feel like that's kind of enough speaking.
I mean, Doug, I'm so overwhelmed with your responses. I certainly do not even know what to say. I mean, you've shed light in dark places for me as a designer, and your answers were beautiful. I mean, they were beautiful.
Well, thank you very much. That's good to hear.
Thank you a lot. But I think you're right. Actually, we should encourage more junior designers to learn more about accessibility and inclusion, so that if they learn it from their basics, then it helps them in the future, and it helps the company as well. I mean, the organization that want to include people, and when you start a product that scales beyond like a particular ecosystem, then you know it becomes more diverse. I mean, you have it gets to a range that you can't even control. Let's look at companies like Netflix, Airbnb, and the likes. I mean, they can't really control where their product gets to an extent. Right. Exactly. So I think factoring inclusion and accessibility at the foundation would really help, because Dumi made an example of Twitter, for instance, when they they released the product. They released a feature for voice notes, and they found out in like after they had released it that they didn't include some particular sets of people, and I think that's really that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing. The optics is bad. Every single thing is bad. So yeah, we should actually. Yeah, you touched everything. You touched a lot of things actually.
Well, right, and to your point about Twitter and the voice notes and that sort of thing, it's a cool feature. Like if you can use it, it's great. But the fact that nobody thought about the accessibility needs along the way of the vast majority of people that wouldn't be able to use it is just, it speaks to me at least, that they don't quite have that culture of thinking inclusively, right? That they think about accessibility and inclusion after the fact. They don't have that right mindset for it. And that's something that is disappointing, right? You would expect something better from Twitter as a company. And it's one of those things that we need to call out, right? Because if we don't call it out from people that have that inclusion and accessibility mindset, nobody will. So we're kind of the gatekeepers on this. And I appreciate you and everybody else that stepped up and said, hey, what about our friends that can't use this?
So, I think something that we can touch on at this point would be how the major strategy. Sorry.
No, sorry. Take.
No, continue. Go ahead.
No, I actually wanted to spin it up a bit, but I think you might still have something to say. So let's stick to.
Go ahead. I want us to have a conversation. I don't want us to kind of like be.
I want to hear what you have to say, Daniel. Absolutely.
Okay. I'm more geared towards the UX research part of things when it comes to design. So I might digress a bit with my question here. So I'm going to go a bit deeper into UX research and try to tie the conversation around it. So what I'm curious about is the business side of things. How do you get stakeholder buy-in and all the stuff when you're designing? Because sometimes stakeholders don't even have a budget for all these things. And it's really difficult as it's right now to get most of your stakeholders, the business owners and the likes, to even contribute into the research or give you an opportunity to take a lot of research, especially in emerging markets like our country here in Nigeria, where UX researchers, UX research maturity is almost like non-existent.
Right.
I'm really curious to hear how, in such an economy like this, your general experience, how you've been able to communicate business value of inclusive design to stakeholders. And how do you show the business value of inclusive design, to everybody, and track the return on investment on inclusive design?
Right. Yeah. So I approach that a couple of different ways. One of them is kind of the one that I already talked about, that everybody has some sort of accessibility or inclusion need throughout their day, right? So when you think about, we'll take Twitter's voice note example as what we're going through. I just looked this up while you were talking, so I was thinking about this. Only 5% of the world's population has a disabling hearing loss, right? So you begin to think, okay, that's 5%, that's 466 million people, which is a lot of potential users to start off with. But then when you say, okay, only 5% of our users have some sort of permanent hearing loss, you go, okay, well, that's a percentage we can live with. But when you start to think about, okay, well, what about those users who are, want to use this feature, but they're working and they can't actually, turn on the volume on their phone, or maybe they're lying in bed, with their spouse or children or whoever else in the room. They can't turn on, the sound to actually use this voice note, or they can't actually speak into Twitter to actually use this. You begin to think everybody's going to have, or not everybody, but a lot of people are going to have inclusion problems with this, right? A lot of people are going to have accessibility issues with this. So you start to say, it's not just the 5% of the people that we're designing for that have these problems on a regular basis. It's everyone who runs into these problems on a daily basis. And by designing for inclusion and thinking about inclusion from a beginning perspective, you begin to say, how can we make this right from the beginning so that we don't make these missteps like Twitter did, where we have to go back and change and fix failed software. There was a study that was done in 2005, and I think it still holds water. I know it's a bit old, but that essentially looked at the reasons why software fails, why we have these software pieces that don't work well, right? And it listed 12 different reasons, and about a quarter of those reasons came back to things that UX and UX research can mitigate. Things like not understanding the user, not understanding the one's goals and needs. Things like creating unneeded solutions to products, that sort of thing. And when you begin to think about the amounts of stuff that can be mitigated by good UX and UX research practices, if you actually, I created a mathematical formula for this using a few different pieces of that study, but it shows that just on the basis of the time that you save your developers from reworking software, a UX team will always pay for itself. And that doesn't include things like increased conversions. That doesn't include things like customer retention or customer satisfaction. It looks just at the amount of time that you save with the development team. If you want to read about that, you can go to my website, uxnewsmag.com, and just search ROI of UX, and I'm sure it will pop right up there for you. But that's kind of how I've always justified it, is to say, look, if we do this right, if you give us the rein to do what we need, we're always going to at least pay for ourselves. And then when you think about the other pieces of, as far as customer retention, satisfaction, and so on and so forth, we're always going to bump that up. It was always a positive ROI to have a UX team out there. So that's kind of how I sell that, and particularly in this economy that we're in right now, that is very focused on what can you do for me? Show me your value. It's important for us to be talking about dollars and cents if we're trying to talk about the value of inclusion and UX research and UX design in general.
Okay. All right. So we have some questions from the audience. I think we could take a few right now and then possibly continue with the rest of the conversation. Sure. If that's fine.
Absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So I'm just going to read them out. From Catherine. It says, what do you say to designers who say that users with disabilities already have tools to adjust designs? For instance, increase font size, contrast, etc. So we don't need to make adjustments.
Oh, that's a terrible mindset to take. I mean, for someone that's telling me that, okay. But so for starters, a lot of these tools don't work unless you design appropriately for them. So let's take keyboard navigation, right? Somebody with limited motor skills who has a hard time using a mouse can use a keyboard to navigate through a site. But there are different traps that if you don't design the site properly, you can fall into. So it's possible for you to get stuck on a particular input screen if you haven't, particular input field, if you don't have the order of fields numbered correctly as part of your design process. So when you're talking about creating a design and doing research for a design, you want to make sure that's one of the things that you think about is people that are navigating this with a keyboard. How are we going to order which fields they're jumping from keyboard to keyboard? It's also possible for people that say use screen readers, right? Screen readers is one of those assistive technologies out there that allows a lot of people to access the internet. Screen readers and the way that screen readers navigate is very, very different. And there's a lot of personal preference involved with it, but some people will use their screen readers to jump from text that's marked on a page as H1 text, heading 1 text. And they'll kind of jump through to that to try and get from point to point to point. But if you don't have that actually designed and called out that this needs to be labeled as an H1 text piece, a heading 1 text piece, then that's not going to allow that screen reader to function appropriately. Additionally, you're also thinking about things like even all the way down to the copy that you're writing when you want to talk about UX writing, right? Making sure that the links are descriptive of where they're visiting rather than just sort of a click here sort of thing, right? We know that that's not good from a UX perspective in general, that doesn't help very many people. But when we talk about screen readers, a lot of screen readers will navigate through a page by jumping from link to link. So they'll actually jump from one link, read the text on that link, say, oh, that's not what I want. They'll jump to the next link, read the text on that link, and say, okay, that's closer to where I'm trying to get to as far as their navigational concerns are. So if you're not designing correctly, if you're not designing your page navigation, not designing your link text navigation correctly, it doesn't matter how good these assistive technologies are, they're not going to be able to function. So you need to have an understanding of how they work, and you need to have an understanding of the accessibility needs of your users in order to design things that will actually allow them to accomplish the goals that they want.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Doc. I think that should answer it. Catherine, if you have any further questions on that, you could post tomorrow. Okay, so next question. Are there screening criteria? Oh, sorry, this is from Timothy Chatton. Are there screening criteria that you always include when you are recruiting with inclusivity in mind? Okay.
That's a good question. It's very difficult for me to answer that question. I might leave that up to the others in our conversation. And I'll give a caveat with that, is that most of what I do is government research right now. We have very specific accessibility requirements that we have to meet, but it's very, very difficult sometimes to meet those requirements because a lot of the people that we work with don't have those accessibility needs because they've been weeded out by the system, right? So for instance, if we're designing something for a fighter jet, you can't be colorblind and fly a fighter jet. That's one of the rules that the United States Air Force has, the United States Navy has. So that might be something that we would think about when, looking for whether or not we would include somebody for recruiting purposes normally. But because we know those people don't exist in our user base, we don't have to recruit for that. Additionally, when you think a lot about cognitive disabilities, that sort of thing, when I worked at E-Trade, there was a very low level of people with that because we were working directly with investment advisors. So a lot of the things like dyslexia and that sort of thing just weren't as common for us to look at. It wasn't something that we could find a lot in our user base. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be designing for those people, because that's not, obviously we don't know everybody that's going through these types of issues, and it just means that it was very difficult for us to find, and it's not your normal sort of B2C sort of research space. So it's a little bit difficult for me to answer that question. I'm curious to hear what everyone else thinks about that.
Okay. I want to digress a bit because you mentioned something about the people not being part of your user base, so you don't have to include them.
Right.
Would you say that inclusivity is limited to your target user base, or like the people that you design for?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, basically the question is that when considering for inclusive design, should you limit it to the just the people within the user base that you want? I don't know.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, absolutely. So do we design for just the people that we consider to be part of our user base, or we're designing for everyone regardless of whether or not? Yeah. So it's a different question between recruiting users and the accessibility and inclusion mindset, right? So these users might be very difficult for us to find in our user base, be very difficult for us to recruit. That doesn't mean that we can ignore accessibility needs. It just means that we have to rely sort of on what we know in terms of best practices in order to make pieces inclusive and make pieces accessible. If we can get those folks, that's great. I always want them. I always want that level of feedback. But just knowing that sometimes it's going to be hard to get them just points to a greater need in education, right? And being able to understand what are basic accessibility principles, what are basic inclusion principles, and being able to apply those in your work. Because you're not always going to be able to recruit these people, but you need to make sure that you're still addressing those needs.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. But I would like to chip in something. It may be a little bit unrelated to what you talked about. So I think when we're talking about inclusion, we tend to forget that inclusion also contributes to innovation most of the time. So let's take, for instance, my reading glasses. I mean, it most likely came into play because of an accessibility issue, or maybe like like an accessibility issue. So it drove probably the makers of these glasses to think, I mean, okay, how do we solve for people who has reading issues, or who have sight issues and all that? Then we could also take it back to adjustable chairs. I mean, I'm sure you can adjust the chair you're sitting on right now. Should we test it?
I'm really short, so I have it down as far as I can get. But if I go all the way up, I'm not even sure I'll be in the page anymore. But yeah, absolutely.
So I think inclusive design actually, inclusive design rather, sorry, it contributes to innovation. So most times when we design for a specific set of people and we're trying to include people, we should also think of how far our decisions can influence innovation. So most of the time, when you mentioned that you have a particular requirement for accessibility, I mean, if they are not included in your product, you shouldn't design for them. But equally, you could also see factor them into play. I mean, you could have those considerations for them because there are other companies that all they do is remedy exclusion. They provide remedy for exclusion. So most times when we talk about inclusion, we forget exclusion. Right. So I think it works hand in hand. And this is where industrial design bridges, it has like a bridge with product design and other form of design because everybody are trying to solve a problem for a user.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think about some of the problems that you have, like you talked about with Netflix earlier, some of the inclusive design at scale pieces, right? And how do we manage that? And that's a big challenge, right? The products that I'm working on are used by right now a few thousand people in the United States, defense and intelligence world, which is a relatively small audience, right? When you talk about things like Netflix and Twitter and that sort of thing, you think about the billions of people that reach worldwide. It begins to become all the much more impactful to have inclusive design and to be driving that innovation, as you say. To understand that you have an opportunity at companies that size to create things that are innovative in their approach to inclusion and accessibility that not a lot of other people do. So I always encourage people when I run into those folks to think about that. If you're going to ever get to that level, and I hope to get to that level someday, it's important to have that base understanding and base knowledge about inclusion and accessibility so that you can drive that innovation at scale that not only affects the users in general that use your product, but the world at large, right? When you're touching that many billions of people with your work that you do, every decision that you make has an impact on people you will never meet, never talk to, but you're going to impact their day somehow. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And I really appreciate you, Daniel, bringing up those points because I think those are some really big pieces to keep in mind as we're going through this.
All right. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Doug. So let me bring this conversation back to the motherland. I mean, Nigeria here. So most companies we have in Nigeria, in the Nigerian ecosystem, they are startups. I mean, we have a lot of startups over here. So, but startups, most times, they don't have the time and the funding for extensive research. Like, I mean, honestly, they rarely even have time or anything at all to do with research. And that can be frustrating for designers because we have to do research most of the time to know what to design or to inform our design decisions. So what advice would you give to a startup or somebody working at a startup that wants to do research and factor inclusive design practices in their decisions, but they don't have the buy-in of the stakeholders or the company itself, and they're not even providing you the luxury of time to even do so? What advice would you give in that scenario?
You get one chance to do something right as a startup. That's it. You get one shot at things. If you create a design, create a product as a startup that fails in what it's intended to do or fails to solve the problem that it purports to solve, users are going to leave and they're never going to come back. You are not Microsoft, you are not Apple, you are not Twitter. You don't have that capital built up where people have the knowledge that, okay, they've made a mistake on this, but we expect that they'll go back and fix it. Going back, I know we've harped on Twitter a lot about their about their voice notes piece, but it's a great example of this. Twitter messed that up, but we trust them to go back and make things right, especially when it's brought to their attention. When a startup creates a product that doesn't work, they're done. And however much of investment people have made, that's gone. Those jobs that everybody that's working on the startup, those jobs are gone. You get one shot. So do it right. Spend the time, do the research, and understand truly that what you're creating solves a problem and solves it in a way that is inclusive and accessible. Because if you ignore inclusion and accessibility, like we talked about already, you're not just ignoring the 5% of people that are deaf in the world, you're ignoring the vast majority of people that are going to have some sort of hearing loss. You're not just ignoring, the 1.3 billion people worldwide that have a permanent accessibility need. You're ignoring everyone who's going to have some accessibility need throughout their day. It's imperative to design for accessibility from a success of a startup perspective. Every user counts, right? I've heard that brought up a lot in startups. Every user we can get our hands on counts. Every user we can get our product in front of counts. We need to make sure that we're getting this in front of as many people and being just as viral and successful as we can with that. And you can only do that if you're truly designing for as many people as possible. UX research work will always pay for itself in terms of, like I said, nothing else development time, but in terms of understanding the problems, one's goals, and needs. One of the things that's really interesting, I think, from a startup perspective too, is that we see there are all sorts of stories about startup companies that started to solve one problem and ended up solving something completely different, right? Ended up doing something completely different from what their original goal was. And that's because they took the time to research and understand those issues. They took the time to understand those problems, and they were able to change and adjust and create something that actually solved a need or want or goal better. And maybe it wasn't even the need or want or goal that they originally set out to solve, but they realized we have the talent, we have the expertise, we have the ability to do this. The only way to be successful as a startup is to really understand the problem as best you possibly can and give a unique, novel solution that is better than what's out there. You can only do that with research.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I kind of want to interject a bit because so I kind of went to this inclusive design conference a couple of months back when we were still allowed to interact with the outside world, and and I heard this really interesting quote from a guy named collaborative design and a lot of like creative stuff, but he's also an advocate for inclusion. Right.
I'm sorry, I missed the name there. You broke up for a second. Who was this?
Oh, sorry, Phil Terry. So Phil,
okay.
Yeah, Phil Terry. So so he said something that stood out to me. He said that in thinking of how to design for inclusion, you need to focus on understanding how to design for inclusion first, and then check yourself against those things, right? And when he said that, that kind of just kind of lit a light bulb in my head, and it made so much sense, right? So I kind of want to hear your take on that, like how, like what are your feelings? I'm about to use the research, like what are your feelings around it? But what are your feelings around that? What do you think about that? Like I want to get your take on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Inclusion. I thought you. I think you mistakenly said inclusion twice. You didn't mean to say exclusion.
Sorry. See, so the quote was, in thinking of how to design for inclusion, you need to focus on understanding how to design for exclusion first, and then check yourself against like those things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's the quote. I didn't say it twice. Did I say it twice?
Yeah, you did. I was about ready to pop off an answer on that one, so thank you for rescuing me.
Oh, for real? Oops.
Well, that's an interesting quote. I haven't read that one before. Let's see what I can do with it. Thank you, Daniel. So in order to design for inclusion, you need to understand how to design for exclusion first, correct?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would say I haven't heard that quote before, and it's an interesting question. So I'm kind of thinking about this out loud as I go through it, because I tend not to pay a whole lot of mind to exclusionary design, but it kind of goes back to a lot of what we go to in my current job, and that we know that, for instance, there are a lot of colorblind pilots. I've talked about that as kind of a thing. So we sort of say, okay, nobody who's ever going to be using this product is going to be colorblind, which might be true for the current product that we're working on. But I think, particularly from a research perspective, research can be repurposed, right? Just because we did research on a particular project doesn't mean that that research is only going to be valuable for that one particular piece. One of the things that I love creating whenever I go to a new place is a research library that is all of the user interviews that we've done, transcripts of those interviews, the questions that we've asked, who we talked to, what topics we covered, so that as we go back and we create this library, we can go back and say, okay, we're working on a project that's somewhat similar to X, Y, and Z. So let's go see if we have any research that we've done in the past on X, Y, and Z, and dig up those interviews and do some sort of pre-research, right, before we go talk to stakeholders or users again. And let's see what data we can find that we collected, right? And so it just means that if you are being exclusionary in your research and what you're trying to accomplish, you're hampering your research efforts down the line. And you're hampering, to Daniel's point, your innovation and your creativity, especially from the UX design perspective. You know, as researchers, our job is not to design a solution, it's to understand a problem, right? If we aren't fully understanding a problem, even for pieces that we think we can exclude, it means that we're not giving complete data, and that's only going to hamper us down the road. But I think that's my take on that. I don't know how accurate that is, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it.
I don't know.
I mean, so so he kind of had us. Do you hear me? Sorry, I don't know why my sorry. I've been having issues all week.
That's okay.
One thing that he did for us, or he made us do during that like session, was he made us like there was like a problem space. So I don't know, like think about designing an exclusive, I would say exclusive, but not exclusive, but like an experience that excludes people from a restaurant. So what would you expect to see there, right? So we kind of started talking about maybe tables without chairs, like standing tables, and instead talking about So we kind of like we went through like we kind of went through that brainstorming phase where we kind of were focusing a bit on like all the bad things that could possibly happen and how we could possibly totally forget like people that were living with disability and design to exclude them, and then we flip it. So it's like instead of having like standing tables, we should have like lower tables, adjustable tables. Or we should have, instead of having like a cramped up space where people kind of there's no space for like enough for like a wheelchair or for I don't know any other accessibility. So we would have this, instead of having a place where people can only pay with cash, we should have places where people that maybe have like maybe a cerebral disease that kind of impedes like how they can react and move, can pay with, because a lot of people can pay with like their watches and with their phones, right? So instead of designing an experience that like only asks for cash, we can design an experience that allows for people to be able to pay with like their phones and their watches and all that, right? So that's kind of what that was about. Maybe I should give the example earlier on, but you also made really valid points.
To contribute to what you said, initially I didn't understand your question. I was like, why do you have to design for exclusion first before thinking about inclusion? I was about to attack you, but now that you because so I read an article, I think it was 2 years ago. A lady had to sue a bank in Nigeria, like in our country, and she said something about she's disabled. I mean, she uses a wheelchair, and she could not get into the bank because the bank had stairs first, then it equally now had a door, a very narrow door. So it was difficult for her. She told somebody to assist her to move up the stairs, only for her to get to the bank, to the front of the bank, and find out that she couldn't even get into the bank. So there was an outrage, and she was like, why didn't they design the doors or the stairs for people with disabilities and all that? So when Dumi asked that question, I was about to say, why do I have to design for exclusion first? But I think most times designers or a lot of focus is really centered around product designers or digital product designers, and we tend to neglect other factors. I mean, the non-digital products, the things that we go through every day. I mean, you get sometimes there are public transportation that doesn't even encourage disabled people to get into it. There are doors at malls or restaurants that you can't even get into. And I think inclusion design should really cut across every single aspect of design, industrial design, even things that are even out of design. So the moment we start to think that way as a designer, it will really inform our decision in every single part. So even when we find ourselves doing stuff that doesn't really necessarily involve we carrying a computer system or anything, we are thinking inclusion, inclusion, inclusion. So I don't know. So what do you have to say about non-digital products or buildings or vehicles that doesn't really consider people? How do we, as designer, how can we change that notion in the world? I mean, how do we change that?
Yeah. Understanding that design and user experience design doesn't stop at the edge of a screen is a big part of it, right? Everything we interact with every day has some element of user experience design in it. You know, for instance, oh gosh, do I have it here? I'm not sure that I have it within reach, but I have an air conditioning and evaporative cooler unit at my house recently. Well, I've had it for a while. Recently, I had a problem with it where I needed a particular tool in order to solve this problem. And this tool I found at the hardware store as kind of a multi-tool, right? So I don't know if, gosh, I'm sure this is around here somewhere. You're gonna have to bear with me while I rummage through this because this is important to the story to try and show you the tool. And I also get to bring out my giant toolbox that happens to be sitting right here. So, but I want to show you this. I want to show you this so that we can talk about it. I actually have no idea you're going to ask this question, so I have no idea if this tool is in here, but it should be. I'll take a look for it here. But essentially, what it has at the top are like these little pinchers, right? It's got like a sharp blade. It's meant to be able to cut pipe, and there are two handles to it that allow you to sort of move it together like you would a pair of pliers, right? The way that it was packaged was that it was in this kind of plastic packaging with the tip open, the sharp piece open, and the only hole that you could get your sort of finger into to try and open that packaging was right between the two sharp pieces of plier. Yeah, exactly. I saw this. I knew that this was a problem. And even knowing that it was a problem, I still managed to cut the heck out of my finger doing it. And it just goes to show that, someone out there is saying, okay, how do we solve this? Well, we want to show that we have this particular tool available to them. So we're going to open it up so that they can see it. Okay, that's great. But at the same point in time, I wonder how many people have cut the heck out of their fingers just like I did. I really wish that tool was on the top of my toolbox because that thing is nasty to look at. It's nice
I don't think you should search for it. Don't search for it, please, so you don't cut your fingers.
Yeah, it was not fun. I'm gonna stop rummaging around because I know the sound for it isn't very good, and that doesn't make for a very good watching. But I was hoping it'd be right on top there. Oh, here it is. I have it right here. So this is the thing, right? Let me get my zoom camera back on. So this is the thing, and it's let's see if I can get these open. Now I can't even get the things open. That's not good. Oh, that's why we gotta. This is the other thing is that I'm not very handy. So, but this is what we're looking at right here is this little sharp piece here. And this spot right here is the only part of the packaging you could get in to pull the packaging out. So I went to get it in, started to pull it out and just got my finger right there on the edge of it. And it's not a small thing by any stretch of the imagination. So it's just an example of non-digital products absolutely have a user experience piece in that. I'll tell you, after that happened to me, I was hacked off, right? But we see, non-digital experience. And one of the things I love to tweet about are non-digital, particularly bad UX. Like even this shirt that I have here that I'm wearing right now. I'll see if I can adjust my camera for this. says launch the octopus on it, right? So this actually comes from a car button. So this is a button on someone's truck that just has this logo on it, right? Nothing there, no text to it. So this is all you see is a button that says this, right? Originally, a while back, I tweeted, what does this button mean? Does it mean launch the octopus, activate the grow light, or turn on the shower, right? With the concept of being not every piece that you have, not every icon that you have is going to be universally understood. And that except for a very small handful of icons, as I try not to cut my fingers while I put this tool away, except for a very small handful of icons, those aren't going to be understood by people. And even some of the ones that we think are universally understood aren't going to be understood, right? It's just another example of, some of those physical UX pieces that we tend to ignore, but they're out there everywhere. They're all around us and we can't ignore them. So for even people that are working in UX and product design and industrial design outside of the context of a screen, it still matters. Knowing these pieces of inclusivity, knowing these pieces of accessibility, and knowing good design principles, UX design practices are still important for people that are doing design outside the context of a digital environment.
All right, so a quick one. We seem to have pointed out that there are a lot of use cases to consider when designing for inclusivity. So how would we get just enough research done, in the sense, like, because now it seems like it's possible that in trying to be inclusive of everyone, we might get stuck in a sort of research loop where we just keep on doing research and so basically how can we make sure that we're doing just enough research to not get stuck and move forward with our findings?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really key point. I think one thing that a lot of researchers do that's important as a good first step is to always make sure that you're writing a research plan with each one of your projects, whether it's small, large, doesn't really matter. Always write a research plan. In that research plan, you should be stating what you're going to be doing in terms of research practices, why you're going to be doing it, and what you expect your results to be in terms of I shouldn't say results, what you expect your output to be. So what are we going to present? So for a research project, I might say, okay, we're going to do 7 stakeholder interviews. We're going to talk to 8 users. We're going to do a data metrics analytics process. And these are the things that we want to look at. We want to look at how does this affect people of different age ranges? How does this affect people with color blindness? How does it affect people with cognitive disabilities? And I might call out some of those specific pieces that we're looking at. Different designs and different pieces that you're working on are going to have larger effects on people with different accessibility needs. That's where some of the education pieces come in, right? Being able to understand sort of your basic accessibility and inclusion principles is going to help you to know what to look for on a particular design, on a particular project, on a particular goal. By having that baseline understanding, you can say, okay, we really need to pay attention to this particular piece. So if I was working on a new form for a website, right? One of the things I might need to say is, hey, we really need to make sure that we get some data about keyboard navigation on this one, and make sure that we're thinking about, how our users navigate through our site using keyboard navigation, right? So we can spend some time to try and do some work to try and get some data from that in terms of either user interviews or some of the data metrics analytics that we can provide through some of the different tools that we have to try and understand that. But understanding those pieces, understanding where the major impacts might be, and putting that in as part of your research plan is paramount to making sure that you're not over-researching things and that you're researching the right things.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, pretty much covered it. Right. Okay, so I think we can circle back. Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I said thank you.
Okay, I think we can circle back to the audience for a bit. A few people have some more questions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so. Oh, okay. I think this question might be similar to what we just answered, but I'm just gonna. Should your businesses or solutions users scope limits? Sorry, what? Sorry, hold on. Should your businesses or solution users scope limit the level of inclusiveness or accessibility of your design, or can you go overboard?
I don't think it's possible to go overboard per se. I think that depending upon the services that you're offering, you are going to focus on different areas more, kind of related to our last question. Depending upon what you're working on, the services that you're offering, the pieces that you're creating, you may need to focus on particular areas more than others. But if you have, like I said, a good inclusive mindset and are using that as the basis of your design and the basis of your design practices, that should mitigate a lot of the issues you might run into with pieces that you either don't get an opportunity to research or aren't focusing your research on.
Okay, so next one says, how would you specifically design to or research for those with impaired vision?
Yeah, that's a tough one, because vision impairment runs a gamut of a lot of different things, right? It can be something, are you nearsighted? Are you farsighted? How badly nearsighted are you? How farsighted are you? Are you colorblind? Do you have low visual acuity, so you can't see things that are moving very well? Are you completely blind or partially blind? Are you blind in one eye? There are all sorts of different things that might come into play there. As far as how you research for those things, it's going to depend very much on the project. So I'm not sure I can get into every single way that you might research those, especially considering the variety of projects you might have and the variety of visual pieces that you might go through. But one of the things that you could do would be eye tracking studies, of course, right? To see how well eye tracking works on a particular site. Mouse tracking is another one of those things. So mouse tracking, I don't know. I want to make sure I define those very quickly for those that haven't heard of them. Eye tracking is essentially using webcam and specialized software to measure people's eyes as they go across the screen to understand what they're looking at, how long they're staying in a particular area. And the usual output of that you see most common is a heat map, right? So you'll see something where yellow and red is kind of where people spent most of their time looking on a screen, where most of the users spent most of their time. Green is kind of part of the time. And then if it's white, yeah, they're not really there. Mouse tracking kind of does the same thing, but instead of following your eyes, it follows your mouse. There's about an 80% correlation between a mouse tracking survey and an eye study survey, meaning that about 80% of the time, where your mouse is on a screen is where your eyes are going to be looking as well. So it's one of those things that you can certainly use as kind of an example of how you might do some studies for folks that have visual impairments and making sure you're including them as well. And kind of understanding that too. You might also look at particular demographics, right, to understand whether or not your particular target audience has a particular issue. So if you are, say, trying to create something for older adults, I had a friend that recently that was working on an application to help older adults find medication in their communities at low cost. One of the things that they were running into is that a lot of people were abandoning their app. They were installing it and then not using it. They were trying to figure out why. And one of the reasons why they eventually ran into is because a lot of the older folks have poor vision, right? They weren't really thinking about that. They were kind of designing to standards in terms of some basic design accessibility pieces, but they weren't thinking about how can we really pump this up for our demographic? How can we make things much more contrast efficient, and how can we make things much easier to read? So they ended up bumping up the text using very, very high contrast images and high contrast background and foreground colors, and made things significantly more accessible for their particular audience, because they understood that this might be something that they had a particular accessibility need. Did a couple of studies and ended up making a few changes as well too in some of their approaches, but it was interesting to see, okay, that's sort of one thing that they were doing to try and get some research and trying to understand their audience as well too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was a really insightful part. Okay, I think Duni wants to ask something, so I'll just.
Sorry, I have a quick question. So someone kind of just sent me a tweet, and he was kind of, I'm going to read it verbatim. So, hey guys, wonderful discussion. I have been considering the issues around inclusive design since I attended an IDF meetup recently. However, given the options of products available in today's digital aimed at peak experiences for a small group of individuals, a product like Microsoft Word might take design for inclusion to a higher level. However, I think most non-generic products should be designed for a niche market rather than for everyone. So I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah. One thing that's key for me in answering that question is the word market in that, right? Your market is not your users, if that makes any sense. Market is a marketing phrase, right? When we talk about who your market is, that's going to say, okay, our market is people, primarily people ages 18 to 35, white males from Denver, Colorado. Okay, great. That's who your market is, but that's not who you're designing for necessarily. Just because that's your target audience doesn't mean that those are the only people that are going to be using your product by any stretch of the imagination. And if your product is successful, particularly, those people will absolutely not be the only people that'll be using your product. So understanding your market and understanding your users are two very different things. You might be able to limit your research in terms of when we talk about, understanding what potential accessibility or inclusion issues that particular group might run into. You might be able to limit your research that way, but that doesn't excuse you from accessibility or inclusive design responsibility. What that does is it allows you to focus your research on more of those pieces more efficiently. But it's never okay to just throw accessibility or inclusion out the window because it doesn't fit your market. Simply put, your market is not, or your users are not your market, and all of your users are going to have some sort of accessibility or inclusion need throughout their day, regardless of whether or not that's common in their demographic.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you for answering that. I have a quick question. How do you handle designing for inclusion? Okay, I'll make an example. For instance, I'm working on a product, and I'm part of the team, the UX team involved. But we are the product serves a wide range of demography. I mean, something like Twitter, for instance. And in as much as you can make decisions, design for inclusion, you can't really cover all touch points for the constraints involved in accessibility most of the times. Yeah, because you mentioned something about some people having maybe like light sensitivity, some people having color blindness and likes. You can't really cover everything. So how do you
We lost Daniel there for a second.
I think now it gave them like an eye opener because until they got feedback
for a minute. So can you say what you just said? Can you say what you just said? Like
Sorry about that. My internet. Okay.
That's okay.
So I said I was making an example of Twitter, for instance. They had to get feedback, although it was negative feedback anyway, before they could understand how much of an impact the product had over like people. So how do you consider a lot of constraint involved, and how do you design for that? Do you wait for feedback from your users before you can iterate on the decision, or you I don't know, you chill on, you calm down, you keep on you keep on researching until you can cover? I mean, how do you even measure what you can cover in terms of accessibility?
Right. So you can limit your research practices in terms of focusing on what areas you're going to, in terms of defining what areas you're going to focus on. And that's absolutely necessary. Some of the ways you can do that are looking at the data, metrics, analytics of your site and your users and understanding what accessibility needs are most common to them. But another big thing that I think sometimes get overlooked is doing usability studies. So particularly pre-release usability studies along the way as part of the design process, right? I think what happens with a lot of UX teams is they'll go in, they'll do the research, they'll create a design, and then after the design is done, but before it gets released, They'll do some amount of usability testing to verify, okay, this is actually solving our problem. And most of the time, the bias is to go ahead and release because we've already done all the work to do the design. We've already done all the work to try and solve this problem. So let's just move it along as long as we've got, some inkling that this is going to be useful for someone. When really the most effective way to make sure that you're hitting all the marks is to do iterative usability testing along the way during the design process, particularly on projects that are larger and have a larger impact and larger risk of failure. It's tremendously important to do that because usability studies will help mitigate a lot of those pieces. It makes me wonder how many usability studies Twitter did on that particular piece to see whether or not, as they were going through it, if this was something that was going to hit the mark for everyone. It seems to me that somebody somewhere would have stopped and said, hey, I'm deaf, I can't participate in your usability study. And that alone should have rang alarm bells and gone, oh yeah, we didn't think about that, right? Sometimes even during the recruitment process, you always have to be listening for that feedback of, I can't participate because of X, Y, and Z. And you go, oh, well, maybe we need to take a step back and consider something. Even your recruitment process can tell you things. So just, making sure you're running those iterative usability testing are going to help mitigate a lot of those issues. And I will say, if you work on enough projects, you're going to fail at some point in time. Like, it is what it is. Nobody's perfect. Hopefully, if you're a startup, you don't fail on the first thing that you do, like we talked about. But it will happen, right? And part of being a good UX professional, I think just being a good professional, a good person in general, is understanding that failure is going to happen and that how you respond to it is important. Do you shirk responsibility? Do you try and pass it off to somebody else? Even if you can, positively do that, or do you take responsibility for your actions and your failures and say, this is what went wrong. This is how I'm going to fix it. Not only to the people that you work with and to your users, but to yourself as well too. I think we need to be mindful of embracing those pieces internally when they come along and not just giving them lip service. So that's kind of how I approach those pieces, and hopefully that's helpful for somebody that finds themselves in a similar situation.
Okay. So I have a quick question. Would you say that it's possible that in trying to factor in other users that like ultimately have to be considered in the design process, we might also be sort of alienating regular users, or I don't know if regular users is the right term.
Right.
Yeah, but basically like how to design for one faction without alienating the other faction, or like not innovating enough for the other faction. Mm-hmm. I hope my question is clear.
Yeah. It is. One of the good things about being a UX researcher is that I don't have to deal with the design side of things as much as I used to. And to that point, right? My goal as a researcher is to understand the problems. It's not really to provide solutions. It's to make sure that my design team has a full set of data to help them understand the issues and that they can go out and be innovative and create awesome solutions. I'm blessed to work with Jason Ogle, who runs the User Defenders podcast. He's on my team, tremendously talented visual designer. Chris Lenhart, also on my team, is a tremendous world-class design professional. I always feel a bit inadequate compared to them from a design perspective. They're so good at what they do. But what working with these folks has made me realize is that great design is invisible, right? We've heard that before, but I don't think we fully appreciate it. When it comes to the context of accessibility and inclusion, we can take that to say great design is invisible except for when you need it, if that makes sense. So for people that have these accessibility and inclusion needs, we want to make sure that those tools are there, that those options are there, that we are allowing them to experience the site in their chosen way that's going to allow them to be most effective in doing it. But for those that don't need that those tools and those options aren't interfering with what they're trying to get done, is a very delicate balance to strike. And the best way that I've found to be able to strike it consistently is to practice it over and over and over again on project after project. If you are working on these pieces as a visual designer, you need to understand that, especially at first, when you're tackling accessibility and inclusion, you probably won't succeed as well as it in somebody that's been doing it for a long time, and that's okay. And the important thing is to practice, to try and understand, and to try and get better. And to get to that point where you're making tools that allow everyone to be included in their particular chosen way, that don't interfere with people that don't particularly need those tools. It takes practice, it takes work, it takes education, but it pays dividends not only for your employer, but for you in the long run, because it's one of those skills that you can go out and say confidently when you go out and looking for that next new job, that next big thing, where you're writing that next book or recording that next podcast or whatever it might be, to help yourself or the UX design community, and say, I have this tool, this is something that's important to me and something that I want to talk about. Case in point, here I am. So I guess that's a good example of that. But that's hopefully that helps clarify some of that a little bit.
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, okay. So let me circle back to the audience and then see what they have to say.
We're almost at time, so maybe we can just take one more question and then we can just kind of round things up.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, actually, there aren't that many questions.
Okay.
It's just, there's actually just one. It says that would you categorize adding subtitles and videos as being inclusive?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
It says, would you categorize adding subtitles and videos as being inclusive?
It's certainly accessible. I don't know if you'd necessarily qualify it as specifically inclusive. And one of the things that you talk about when we talk about hearing impairment and that sort of thing is that you want to make sure that for videos and audio content in particular, that there's some sort of alternative source, right? So whether that's subtitles and whether that's embedded subtitles might be different things. I know that particularly for government accessibility standards, when you have a video, you do have to have subtitles embedded in it. It can't be something you can turn on or off. It's just always got to be down at the bottom of the screen. But even for video content, you could also provide a transcript, right? So maybe somebody just wants to have the transcript read to them, right, through their screen reader, whatever it might be. So you can, attach a transcript as well too. But yeah, I would consider that an accessible solution for some of those things. Where it becomes problematic is particularly with subtitles, is especially translation from language to language can be problematic if you don't have a good interpreter or a good interpretation program. That can become problematic. Also, some of the idioms, particularly when you're going from language to language, don't always translate very well. So trying to get somebody that can help translate something, not just literally when necessary, but particularly with idioms, help to translate them into something that is meaningful to everyone, can be really, really difficult from a subtitle and perspective. So it's something to keep in mind, but they're certainly problematic in different situations. So you do need to be a little bit careful with them.
Okay, I think that answers your question. Okay, so yeah, well, except Jimmy, you were going to.
Yeah, definitely. So cool. So I think somebody actually had a question around recruiting for inclusion. So like, how do you do that? Like, how can you?
Oh, I thought
make sure that like it's inclusive. Did we ask that?
No, I think we already addressed that one, but someone just sent one in. Should I just?
Yeah.
Okay. So. Oh, okay. So this person is asking about your shirts, Doug. He says, so this is a question about your shirts. I believe the icons were supposed to mitigate the language barrier. I was just thinking, what would the designers have done, or what could the designers have done better?
Yeah, it's a tough one. So the actual icon on my shirt actually means turn on the bed lights in the truck, right? So there's a light on the back of the truck that you can turn on that turns on the bed light so you can see what the heck you're doing back there in the dark. I've had that question before. I originally posted this as a very, very tongue-in-cheek sort of thing, but like, you know, what is this? But and in terms of reminding people, hey, not all icons are universally accepted. Make sure that you're including text where appropriate. One of the things that's been brought up to me is that particularly in the automotive industry, it costs a lot of money to label different buttons in different languages depending upon where the car is being released, right? And that there is in general a low barrier to a lot of these buttons. You go, I don't know what this button does. Let me press it. The odds are that you're going to, you know, actually launch an octopus out of the back of your truck are pretty slim. So there is a bit of that involved, but you do want to make sure. I'd still say that this isn't a particularly accessible button for a lot of different reasons. But you want to make sure that you're kind of sticking to all those standards that you possibly can, particularly when we talk about cultural pieces that may not translate well, right? I don't think that this particular icon is a great example, but one thing I did see recently was a shirt that somebody was wearing that they had on their shirt. They had all sorts of different icons for things that they might want as they were traveling countries where they didn't speak the language. So I want food. Oh, I'll point to, you know, the plate and fork here. Or I need a bathroom, so I'll point to the icon of the toilet over here, right? All these different things.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, it's a great idea until you start to think a lot of those are very, very Western or very, very culturally specific, right? So what if you're in, say, a country that doesn't use a knife and fork, and you're pointing at, okay, I need something to eat, so I'm pointing at a knife and fork, and they're going, okay, you want to buy silverware, or you need me to bring? I don't know what's going on here. Right? That's kind of an extreme example. I think most people would get that, but it's still kind of one of those things that you might consider, right? So it's just an example of you need, and I've gotten away from the original question completely, so I apologize about that. But you do need to keep in mind those cultural sensitivities and those cultural considerations when designing for accessibility and inclusion as well.
Okay, that was actually a good one.
Yeah.
So just to add to this is practically nothing, but I don't know if you guys are familiar with Kate Holmes, KATHOLMES. So she runs a blog. Would I call it a blog? A community actually called Mismatch.design. So I think anybody that wants to read further on inclusion and accessibility should actually check it out. So I'm going to quote something from what she said. It's one of my favorite quotes from her. She said, our job as designer isn't to tell our users how to interact with what we create. Our job is to create something that they can interact with in whatever way they choose to interact with it.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. So check it out. Mismatch.design. It's a fantastic thing. She has a couple of articles and a couple of talks there, and she's a big advocate for inclusion. I mean, that's practically what she does every day. So
I mean, we all should be. So.
Yeah, check it out.
I will definitely. I just pulled it up right now. I'm definitely checking that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a book. There's actually a book, Mismatch: How Inclusion Shapes Design.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that one's on my reading list. I haven't gotten to it.
Yeah, me too.
And that's gosh, she wrote that. Yeah. Okay. So that was so Kate actually wrote that too. Okay, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to yeah, I've already downloaded that one already. I just haven't read it yet. So I need to get on it.
Sweet. So thank you so much, Doug. We're almost out of time, so I don't want to keep you here longer than we plan. You have given us a lot to think about, right? I'm definitely watching this again because like I feel like there's a couple of things I probably missed because I don't know, just like so much information. But thank you so much. It's been really insightful. Thanks for taking time out to chat with us. I don't know if you have any last words for maybe people that are like looking to adopt some inclusive practices while like they're conducting research or creating amazing products. or if you just have any last words on how we can make like our products more inclusive, that would be great. If you don't, that's absolutely fine too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be speaking with all of you today. You're also very smart and talented, and I really appreciate you bringing me on. It's really been a privilege to talk with everyone today, and you've had some wonderful questions for me, and made me think about things I hadn't fully considered. So I appreciate that. As far as things that you can do from a design perspective, it goes back to understanding the basic tenets, right? Understanding the basic pieces, basic needs, and what you can do to sort of make those great. And I apologize, I'm kind of clicking around here because I do have a class on Skillshare that I offer about design for UX, accessibility for UX designers. One of the things that I want to do, and I will post here to my Twitter account, which is Doug Collins UX. I'll post it here just after the class is over so I can focus on answering this question. I'll put up a link for the next 100 people that want to go take the class. You can take the class for free, 100%, shouldn't charge you a dime. And you can go and learn that for the next 100 people that sign up for it. I'll make sure you just use the link. Should have it up within the next half hour or so on my Twitter account. You can follow it there. So yeah, I want to make sure that that's available for every people. I'm actually going to move that class off of Skillshare onto YouTube at some point, so it's available for everyone. Probably be done that here in the next month anyway. So keep an eye out for that. If you don't want to go through Skillshare, it should be on my YouTube account, which is, again, I'm on YouTube, Doug Collins UX as well. But educate yourself, understand those basic principles. It's a good primer. It's a good introduction. It certainly is not as in-depth as it could be, but it's still, I think, like a 12 or 13 part class that will get you rolling on accessibility for UX design. The other thing that I'd say is that, it's a mindset. So start with that mindset. If you haven't had that mindset before, start to get into it. It will pay dividends. Just make sure that you're doing everything that you need to do, from an education perspective, and I think you'll be okay in the long run. Lastly, just kind of my last closing words, the thing that I usually wrap up with everyone is that, if you want to talk more with me, I am happy to answer whatever I can. I'm on Twitter at Doug Collins UX. You can find my website, denveruxer.com. Check me out on there. I'm pretty much everywhere you can find social media, Doug Collins UX. That if you find somebody with that name, that's me, and I'm all over the dang place on it, but that's where I spend most of my time. I'm happy to answer any questions, talk with you, do whatever I can. I do have a newborn and a 3-year-old, and we're in the middle of a quarantine, so I'm helping out with that. So I might be a bit slow in getting back to you, but I promise I will get back to you. But when this is all over, I'm hopeful at some point I'll be able to get out and do more speaking in person. I really hope to be able to get to Africa at some point in time. Because of what I do, my security situation at work limits where I can actually travel to. Nigeria is on one of the list of countries I can't travel to right now, which is a real bummer to me because I want to be out there so bad. It seems like such an amazing place with everyone I've interacted with is just amazing people. And I'm very proud to be able to talk and speak and help out as I can around the world. So, when this is all said and done and we're getting back out there, keep an eye out for me because I will find a way somehow to get out there. Doesn't matter who I have to con or beg for security protection or whatever it might be. I will find a way to do it. I really appreciate you all taking some time with me today, spending some time. It's been an honor, and thank you all once again.
Thank you so much, Doug. Yeah,
you
can go ahead, though. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's so sweet. Yeah, she's just like yeah, that was so sweet. Like, thank you so much.
It's been exciting.
Yeah, it is. I'm so lucky to have a good Twitter following and a good bunch of people following me, and Nigerians in general have just been tremendous to me, and I can't wait to get out there and meet all the wonderful people that have interacted with me from there. And it will happen at some point in time. I promise I will make it out there, and I can't wait to meet y'all when I do get out there. Absolutely.
Eventually.
Can't wait to meet you. Yeah. Can't wait to meet you soon. Yeah. Oh, okay, sweet. Thank you so much. We're like already 5 minutes over. Thank you so much. I feel like I can say thank you over and over again. We wish your mom a speedy recovery too, because you mentioned earlier on that she's kind of going into surgery. So we pray that that goes well, and we know that that's going to go well, and we hope she has a speedy recovery too.
Yeah, thank you very much. She's under the knife right now, so fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
So yeah. Oh, sweet. So yeah. So I think that's it. We can call it a day. Thank you for everyone that joined. Thank you so much. A special shout out to Asha Koter for hosting this session. Y'all are fantastic. Thank you for the interior design community. Really appreciate you guys. So we're always looking to learn from people doing really cool things in the industry as a whole. So if you'd like to give a talk sometime, or you'd like to nominate someone for a talk, or you just want to connect with us, like, we're pretty nice people, you can reach out to us on Twitter at Asha Koter. So that's ASACOTEIRE, or shoot us an email at hello@ashadesign.com, right? And also don't forget to click the subscribe button that's below. We love you. We appreciate you all. And thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you have an amazing weekend. So thank you guys.
Guys.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks, Collins. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay.